You have probably heard that Isaiah 53 predicts the crucifixion of Jesus. That is the Sunday school answer. That is what gets printed in the study Bible margin notes. And it is true as far as it goes, but here is what that framing quietly robs you of. When Isaiah 53 gets filed under fulfilled prophecy, it becomes evidence in a theological argument. And the moment it becomes evidence, it stops being a wound. You read it looking for the historical checkboxes, the silence, the suffering, the death, and you find them, and you close the Bible feeling like you won a debate. But Isaiah did not write this chapter to win a debate. He wrote it to break something open in the person reading it. Because buried inside the architecture of this chapter is a claim so specific, so personally targeted, that if you actually let it land, not as a prophecy to verify, but as a description of a transaction that already happened on your behalf, it will dismantle every performance-based, earn your way, clean yourself up before you come version of faith you have ever been handed. Isaiah 53 is not a prediction about Jesus. It is a mirror held up to every person who has ever felt like their damage was too extensive to be worth the trouble. And the man in the chapter disagrees. Let me tell you what kind of world produces a chapter like Isaiah 53. The year is somewhere around 701 BC. The Assyrian Empire under a king named Sennacherib has just finished dismantling the northern kingdom of Israel, not defeated it, not occupied it, but erased it. 200 years of national identity, 12 tribes, ancient land grants going back to Joshua, gone. The Assyrian military machine did not simply conquer territories. It had a deliberate, documented policy of mass deportation. You take a people, you remove them from the land that gives them their identity, you scatter them across the empire, and you replace them with foreign settlers who have no memory of what stood there before. The Assyrians called it pacification. What it actually was the systematic destruction of a people's capacity to remember who they were. And Judah was next. Not a rumor, not a distant threat. Sennacherib's own royal annals, carved in stone, discovered in the ruins of Nineveh by British archaeologists in the 19th century, now sitting in the British Museum, those annals describe Hezekiah of Jerusalem as a man shut up, like a bird, in a cage. That is a direct quote from an enemy king's victory record. Israel's neighbor to the south, the last surviving fragment of the divided kingdom, was surrounded, besieged, and by every available military calculation, finished. Isaiah was writing in that room. Not metaphorically, literally. The prophet, whose scroll contains 66 chapters of some of the most soaring theological poetry ever committed to ink, was operating inside an active siege. The smoke of burning Judean cities was visible from Jerusalem's walls. The message that reached Hezekiah from Sennacherib's field commanders was designed to be psychological as much as military. 2 Kings 18:27 records the Assyrian commander shouting his ultimatum not in Aramaic, the diplomatic language both sides understood, but in Hebrew, deliberately. In Hebrew, so the civilians on the wall could hear every word. So the people would panic before the rams hit the gate. That is the world. Not a seminary classroom, not a quiet village where a mystic sits peacefully under a fig tree composing beautiful verses about suffering. A city under psychological siege, surrounded by the most effective army in the ancient world, whose propaganda department understood that breaking the population's will was more efficient than breaking the walls. Into that world, Isaiah writes about a servant who does not retaliate. Stop and feel the weight of what that would have sounded like to the original audience. These were not people who needed to be convinced that suffering was real. They were living inside it. What they were desperate for, what every prophet before Isaiah had been expected to deliver, was the promise of divine military intervention. The arm of the Lord was striking the enemy down. The kind of rescue that looked like rescue. Power answering power. And here is Isaiah describing the arm of the Lord. The very same phrase, Zero Adonai, used in Exodus when God dismantles Egypt, and it does not look like an army. It looks like a man no one wanted to look at. That dissonance was not an accident. It was the entire argument. Before we go any further into the chapter itself, there is a word in Isaiah's vocabulary that you have to understand, because this word is the invisible architecture underneath everything he writes in the second half of his book, and without it, you will keep reading the servant passages as tragedy when Isaiah is writing something far more specific than that. The word is eved. In English translations, it consistently comes out as servant, and that translation is accurate. But it is incomplete in the way that translating hesed as kindness is technically accurate and completely misses the weight of what the Hebrew is carrying. Eved in the ancient Near Eastern world was not a neutral word. It did not describe a person with a job title. In the social architecture of the ancient world, an eved was someone whose identity was structurally defined by their relationship to another. An eved did not have a private life that existed independently of their master's purposes. Their agenda, their direction, their daily movement, all of it was oriented by someone else's will. But here is the thing about eved in Israel's own national story that changes the valence of the word entirely. The Israelites in Egypt were Eve to Pharaoh. That is the word Exodus uses repeatedly, the same word. Enslaved. Defined by someone else's purpose. Worked until their backs gave out making bricks for monuments to a man who treated them as instruments. And the Exodus story is precisely the story of God dismantling that eved relationship and redirecting it. You were Pharaoh's eved. Now you are mine. So when Isaiah begins calling this mysterious figure my eved, God's eved, he is not describing a servant with low social status. He is describing someone whose entire identity has been voluntarily reoriented around God's purposes, not enslaved to them, oriented toward them. The same way a compass needle is not enslaved to north. It is built for it. And then there is the second word, the one Isaiah pairs with eved in chapter 53 that almost nobody talks about. Asham. You will find it in verse 10. When you make his soul an Asham for sin. English translations render this as guilt offering or offering for sin, which is accurate, but the theological precision of the term is far more specific than that. In the Levitical sacrificial system, the detailed, almost bureaucratic instructions in Leviticus 5 and 6, the Asham was not the same as a Olah, the burnt offering, or the Ziba Shelamim, the peace offering. The Asham was the specific sacrifice required when a violation had created a legal debt, not just broken a relationship, created an unpaid obligation. The Asham acknowledged that something was owed and provided the mechanism for that debt to be extinguished. Think about what that means in context. A sin offering could address the condition of the sinner, the guilt, the impurity, the broken fellowship. But the Asham addressed the ledger, the outstanding balance, the specific claim against you. And in the entire sacrificial system, the Asham could only be completed when a reparation payment was made alongside the sacrifice. You brought the animal, and you brought the repayment. The two together closed the account. Isaiah 53:10 says the servant's soul, his nephesh, his entire inner person, his life, becomes the Asham. Not the animal on the altar, not a ritual substitution standing at one remove from reality. The servant himself is the mechanism by which the legal debt gets zeroed out. 700 years before a Roman execution method produced the conditions this chapter describes in anatomical detail. One more word. Because Isaiah does not use just any noun when he describes what the servant bears. The Hebrew text in verse 4 uses two distinct words side by side, Choli and Makavot. Most English translations smooth them into grief and sorrows, or sickness and pain, which loses the distinction entirely. Choli refers to physical disease, the kind of affliction that attacks the body from outside, illness, contamination, the deterioration of the flesh. And Makavot is a different register entirely. It refers to anguish that bends a person from within. Mental torment, the specific Hebrew pain of a mind that cannot stop. David uses Makavot in the Psalms to describe the interior of a person who cannot sleep, cannot think clearly, cannot escape what is happening inside their own head. Isaiah does not write that the servant bears our sin. He writes that the servant bears our illness and our mental anguish. Both. Together. The full inventory of what it means to be a body in pain and a mind that will not give you peace simultaneously. And the servant picks up both loads as a single nasa, a single act of physical carrying, and walks under the weight of them toward the altar. That is not a theology lecture. That is a description of what was done with everything that is wrong with you. Now, here is the structural detail that changes how you read the entire chapter. Isaiah 53 is not a straight linear narrative. It is not a beginning-to-end account of the servant's suffering moving from point A to point B. It is a chiasm, a mirrored, symmetrical literary structure where the opening and closing panels reflect each other, and the theological weight is concentrated at the center like a lens focusing light. Scholars who have mapped the chiastic structure of this chapter have identified 5 mirrored movements. The outer panels, Isaiah 52:13-15 opening and Isaiah 53:10-12 closing, both describe the servant's exaltation. He will be lifted up. He will be very high. He will divide the spoil with the strong. The servant's ultimate status is where Isaiah begins and ends. The poem opens at the destination and closes at the destination. Exaltation frames everything. The second layer moving inward, Isaiah 53:1-3 and Isaiah 53:7-9, both describe the servant's rejection and silence. Nobody recognized him on the way in. Nobody defended him as he went to the slaughter. He had no form or beauty. He was led like a lamb. The parallel is precise. Obscure origins mirrored by silent suffering. Nobody wanted him before. Nobody intervened during. The third layer, Isaiah 53:4-6, this is where the chiasm breaks its own symmetry, intentionally, because at the exact center of the structure, Isaiah places something that has no mirror. It has no reflection because it stands alone as the theological axis of everything. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Isaiah 53:6. That verse is the keystone. Remove it and the arch collapses. Every other element of the chapter, the suffering, the silence, the exaltation, every single movement rotates around that central hinge. The transfer, the moment the direction of the debt reverses. The load that belonged to the sheep moved, actively, deliberately, by the Lord himself, onto the servant's back. And the word Isaiah uses for that transfer is paga, which in other contexts means a violent collision, the crashing of two things that were not supposed to meet. God takes the accumulated directional failure of every human being who ever drifted and crashes it into the servant. That is not gentle atonement theology. That is a cosmic impact event. And it sits at the exact geometric center of the chapter because Isaiah wants you to feel what it means before you move to either side of it. Before you get to the exaltation, before you get back to the rejection, you have to stand at the center and feel the weight of that collision. Because the collision is the point, not the suffering before it, not the victory after it. The moment of transfer, the moment what was yours became his. And if you have been carrying something for a long time, something that keeps its grip on you, no matter how many times you have told yourself to let it go, Isaiah 53:6 is not asking you to try harder. It is telling you that the transfer already happened. The Lord laid it on him. Past tense. Settled. The only remaining question is whether you will open your hands. There is a person named Marcelo. He has been in church his entire life. He knows the vocabulary, hits the right notes during worship, can answer the Sunday school questions with his eyes closed. But somewhere in the last 3 years, something went hollow. He sits in the pew, and he knows, privately, that he does not believe what he is singing. Not because he is angry at God, because he is tired of a version of God that requires him to continuously earn what the songs claim is already free. The checklist never ends. The standard keeps adjusting. The spiritual performance anxiety has become so constant that Marcelo has stopped being able to distinguish his own voice from the voice of failure that narrates everything he does. Isaiah 53 has a word for Marcelo, not a pep talk, not a strategy, not a 4-step plan for spiritual renewal. The chapter looks at Marcelo and says, "The one who absorbed every debt you have accumulated, not just the sins you can list, but the iniquity, the structural crooked bent of your entire inner life, that one chose it. He did not trip into the cross. He walked toward it with his face set like flint. And the reason was not your spiritual performance. The reason was before you had a performance to give." God does not love Marcelo because Marcelo finally got it right. God loved Marcelo enough to send someone to get it right when Marcelo could not. That is the gospel underneath the text. And it is not soft. It is the most demanding, disruptive, checklist-destroying claim in the ancient world. Isaiah 53 does not exist in isolation. The entire architecture of Isaiah's book has been pointing here. The vision of God's holiness in chapter 6 that undid the prophet, the burning coal from the altar that cleansed what could not be cleaned, the portrait of the coming king in chapter 9, the root from Jesse's stump in chapter 11, the suffering servant silently growing in dry ground in chapter 53, the anointed one in chapter 61 who heals the brokenhearted. They are not separate ideas loosely stitched together across 66 chapters. They are a single coherent argument. The argument is this: the God who is so other, so incomparably holy, so far above human reach that even 6-winged burning beings cannot look directly at him. That God, through the mechanism of the servant substitution, closes the distance himself. You did not find your way to God. You were carried there, on the back of someone who chose to go to the altar so you would not have to. Isaiah 53:11 says, "By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities." The word justify, tzadak in Hebrew, is a legal term. A courtroom verdict, not a feeling, not a spiritual impression, a declaration. The case is closed, the record is cleared. Not because the charges were dropped, but because the sentence was served, in full, by someone else, on your behalf. That is not comfortable religion. That is not checklist Christianity. That is not performance spirituality wrapped in inspirational language. That is a God who looked at the full scope of human wandering, every sheep grazing forward without looking up, and decided that the only proportionate response was personal, physical, total substitution. The last thing I want to leave you with is the way this chapter ends. "Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors." Isaiah 53:12. Makes intercession. Present tense. Still ongoing. The work at the cross was finished. That verdict is rendered, sealed, permanent. But the ministry of the servant did not conclude at the grave. He is still, right now, standing between the wandering sheep and the full consequences of the direction they keep drifting. Not to condemn, to advocate, to be, as Hebrews 7:25 would eventually describe it, always living to make intercession. 700 years before the cross, Isaiah could already see what was happening on the other side of it. The servant would not just die, he would die and then keep working. The resurrection does not merely reverse the crucifixion, It unlocks an ongoing priestly ministry that stretches from Calvary to every Tuesday afternoon, where Marcelo sits in a pew, feeling hollow, and a God who is not finished with him, yet keeps interceding on his behalf. That is not religion. That is relationship across an impossible distance, made possible by a servant who chose to stand in the gap. Isaiah wrote in a world that was being dismantled, but he kept writing, because he had seen something in that temple in chapter 6 that the chaos of the Assyrian Empire could not touch. He had seen the throne that does not empty. He had heard the triple kadosh that no army could silence, and he had felt the coal from the altar on his lips, and understood in his bones that the holiness that should have destroyed him was the same holiness that was already saving him. 66 chapters later, he still believed it. And the argument he made, the servant he described, is still, today, the most specific, most audacious, most anatomically precise claim in the history of prophetic literature. It is not a vague spiritual hope. It is a blueprint. And the building it describes was completed on a hill outside Jerusalem, at 9 in the morning, while the silence stretched and the Lamb did not open his mouth. If this gave you something to sit with, share it with someone who thinks Isaiah is too complicated to bother with. It is not. It is a portrait, and it has been waiting for them. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. There is so much more inside this book. We will be here,